Welcome to a new episode of Podcast Infinity. Weeks after winning the presidential election in November 2024, U.S. President Donald Trump issued a threat to the Chinese, warning of additional tariffs beyond the ones he had previously threatened. This was unless China managed to control the trade of synthetic drugs, specifically fentanyl, a drug that has flooded the U.S. and caused the deaths of over 70,000 Americans last year. China is the world's largest producer of chemicals, including those used in the manufacture of fentanyl, which is far stronger than heroin. Until recently, China was producing fentanyl and selling it in its final form to Americans, who have become some of the biggest consumers of this drug globally. Ironically, while the Chinese are the largest producers of the raw materials for fentanyl, they do not use the drug themselves but only export it. Strict drug laws in China have kept the country largely free from the scourge of drug addiction. This has led many American officials to believe that China is intentionally flooding the U.S. with fentanyl to destroy it and avenge the opium wars when their people were forced into addiction, devastating the country. So, what is the story of fentanyl, a drug that Americans view as a grave threat to their youth and economy? What is China's connection to Mexican drug cartels? This is what we'll discuss in today's episode. In 1995, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration approved a drug called OxyContin, developed by Purdue Pharma. This drug, derived from opioid substances, was marketed as a painkiller for moderate to severe pain lasting several days. The drug hit the market in 1996, and Purdue Pharma's marketing campaign reassured the public that it was safe and non-addictive. According to the company, the active ingredient, oxycodone, was slow-releasing and took about 12 hours to fully affect the body. As usual with pharmaceutical companies, Purdue Pharma marketed OxyContin aggressively to doctors and healthcare providers, incentivizing them with gifts and rewards to prescribe it to their patients. The tactics were successful, and the drug became widely popular, especially in rural areas where people tended to rely heavily on painkillers. According to the U.S. Government Accountability Office, OxyContin sales skyrocketed between 1996 and 2001, becoming the most popular and best-selling painkiller on the market. By 2001, Purdue Pharma was making $1 billion annually from OxyContin sales. However, reports began surfacing about the misuse of OxyContin. Firstly, it was often prescribed unnecessarily. Secondly, it was used for non-medical purposes. For instance, by 2003, nearly 50% of primary care physicians dealing with new, undiagnosed patients were prescribing OxyContin. This misuse led to widespread addiction and overdose deaths. Addicts would crush the tablets to snort or dissolve and inject them to experience the full dose of oxycodone immediately, bypassing the slow-release mechanism. Overuse of OxyContin and other opioids contributed to hundreds of thousands of deaths from overdoses and pulled even more into the trap of addiction. This phenomenon was part of a larger opioid epidemic in the U.S., with numerous other opioid-based painkillers, such as hydrocodone, hydromorphone, oxymorphone, methadone, and tramadol, also being widely consumed. Americans became the world's largest consumers of prescription opioids. For example, in 2007, Americans consumed 99% of the global supply of hydrocodone and 83% of oxycodone. Recognizing the crisis, the Bush administration in its final days and the Obama administration in its early years implemented measures to curb the excessive use of opioids. By 2010, these efforts had succeeded in reducing opioid prescriptions, but this marked the beginning of a new phase, the rise of heroin. Starting in 2010, heroin spread widely in the U.S. because it was both a powerful drug and cheaper and easier to obtain compared to prescription opioids. Mexican drug cartels were responsible for flooding the U.S. market with heroin, which became highly profitable for them. By 2015, 93% of the heroin in the U.S. came from Mexico. The cartels had taken over the heroin trade from Southeast Asian producers and became responsible for the addiction of millions of Americans. Heroin remained dominant in the American drug market until a new and terrifying player emerged: fentanyl. This marked the third and most dangerous phase of America's opioid crisis. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid developed by Belgian Dr. Paul Janssen in 1959. While it had been available in the U.S. for decades as a regulated prescription drug for severe pain, its presence in the illicit drug market surged in 2013. Most of this fentanyl came from China. Its ease of production and low cost made it attractive to drug traffickers, who often laced it with other substances to increase profits. For example, a drug dealer could buy a kilogram of pure fentanyl for less than $5,000, cut it with up to 24 kilograms of filler substances, and sell each kilogram for around $88,000. This could yield profits of up to $1.6 million, 20 times the profit from heroin. The danger of fentanyl lies in its potency. It's 50 times stronger than heroin. Many overdose deaths occurred because users unknowingly consumed fentanyl-laced drugs, leading to fatal doses. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration issued warnings about killer heroin mixed with fentanyl in 2014. By 2018, over 31,000 Americans died from fentanyl overdoses. Trump addressed the issue by agreeing with Chinese President Xi Jinping in 2018 to impose stricter controls on fentanyl production. However, the problem persisted as Mexican cartels began producing fentanyl using raw materials sourced from China. The Biden administration resumed cooperation with China on the fentanyl issue in 2023. China imposed restrictions on 3 key fentanyl precursors in 2024. However, the threat remains as alternative methods of producing fentanyl continue to emerge. The opioid crisis costs the U.S. billions annually and remains a leading cause of death for Americans aged between 18 and 45. In 2022, nearly 74,000 Americans died from fentanyl overdoses. In the same year, the Joint Economic Committee of Congress published a study revealing that the opioid crisis cost the United States approximately $1.5 trillion in 2020 alone. This ongoing loss in both human lives and economic terms is a staggering challenge. Trump has promised Americans that he will put an end to this crisis if he returns to the White House. During his campaign, Trump spoke repeatedly about the opioid drug problem, with fentanyl at its core. His proposed solution has 2 main components. 1. Classifying Mexican drug cartels as terrorist organizations, which would allow the U.S. military to target and dismantle them. 2. Threatening China with additional tariffs if it refuses to cooperate with the U.S. by imposing stricter controls on fentanyl precursors or raw materials used in its production. These precursors are vital to Mexican cartels in flooding the U.S. market with various forms of fentanyl. This idea has gained support from some Americans. In October, a group of families who lost loved ones to fentanyl overdoses submitted a petition to U.S. Trade Representative Katherine Tai, urging her office to investigate China's alleged role in exacerbating the synthetic opioid crisis in the United States. They also proposed imposing tariffs on Chinese goods worth at least $50 billion as a means of punishing China for its role in the fentanyl crisis. This brings us to the central question of this episode. Do you believe that China is intentionally using fentanyl as a weapon against America by contributing to its spread among large numbers of Americans?